Now we're going to turn to Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is also right around the same time period, and he writes his Discourse on Method in 1637. Descartes merits the title of the father of modern philosophy, or the father of modernity, and as a philosopher of science, due to his singular devotion to the use of reason and doubt to search for certainty. Now, Descartes was a very precocious child, a mathematical genius who embraced a kind of scientific mind, and he will nurture this to a new level of maturity. One example of his prowess would be that he invented analytical geometry. And so he had a very lucid imagination. And there's a kind of a famous story about how he came up with analytical geometry, which we'll discuss in a minute. He has mathematical insights, and some of his mathematical systems will be used all the way down till today. Descartes will contribute many ideas that will be essential to this epistemological project of modernity. So as the father of modernity, he is going to set forth ideas that will be essential to the modern project. He is, however, hated by postmodernists today. And he's otherwise, they've tried to overcome and abandon the use of reason to attain certainty. And this is one of the things that Descartes is noted for, is the pursuit of certainty. Now, the story of the Cogito is a story that everyone needs to know in the whole history of ideas, in the history of philosophy, because it did begin the modern project. Descartes loves mathematics, and he loves geometry because it gives people certainty. Now, Descartes was French. He lived in early 17th century, and this was a time in which so many things were going on in the world. There were so many different shifts and changes that I think Descartes was looking for certainty, and he loved the type of certainty that he would find in mathematics. And so one day, it was a very, very snowy day, and he was about to go join an army, but he was hindered by this heavy, heavy snowfall. And so he locked himself up in a room to stay warm. It was just a solitary room with a stove in it. And Descartes determined to engage upon a project that is going to forever change Western civilization. As he's sitting there, he determines to use skepticism, which was rampant in his society at that time. He determines to use skepticism to destroy every kind of knowledge that he possibly can. So he doubts that he's even in a room. He doubts that it's snowing. He doubts that he has a body. He doubts everything he possibly can. Now, what he's doing here is he's trying to use skepticism as a fire to burn away anything that is less than certain. If something is certain, then the fire of skepticism won't destroy it. And he indeed discovers one thing that he thinks is that indubitable piece of knowledge, and it's called the Cogito. And so after he doubts all these different things, he comes to the conclusion that he cannot doubt that he's thinking, because to doubt is to think. And so he cannot, and he has to exist to think. So, and he doesn't know what form he exists. He may not have a body. He may just be a floating spirit. He says he might be even deceived by a demon. He might just be a brain in some kind of a vat in some type of evil scientist experiment or something. But he must exist to doubt. And so he comes up with a dictum, the Cogito, basically cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And so he's going to use this Cogito as a kind of starting point. This is where he's going to set his stake down in the ground, and his whole system of knowledge and his whole system of knowing is going to be measured out from that one indubitable starting point. Now, it's also said that in this same experiment that as he was laying in the room contemplating, there was a fly in the room. And the room was roughly a cube. It was a square room with, ceilings probably 9 or 10 feet high. And so the room was roughly a cube. And as he was in there, he noticed that the fly was flying around slowly in a circuitous path. And he began to imagine that if he was to map out the course of the fly's flight, that he could do so with a grid on the wall. And so he could measure the height of the flight of the fly by using a grid on the wall. But he could also measure the depth of the flight on the floor. And then he could also measure the width of the flight on the facing wall. So he had a three-dimensional geometry here, analytic geometry, in which he could, in his imagination, map out the course of this fly moving through space, three-dimensional space. And so he begins his whole endeavor to build the analytic geometry from this imaginative event. So you can see he's a very imaginative person, a genius, and these are going to be some things that will change Western philosophy for a long time. Now, you have to hear this joke because, if you haven't already heard it, you're going to hear it sooner or later. So it concerns Descartes. He walks into a bar, but right before he walks in, there's a horse standing there. And so he asked the horse if he would like to go in and have a drink. And so they go in, they sit down at the bar, and they have a drink. And the bartender comes back over and asks Descartes, would you like another drink? And Descartes says, I think not. And then, poof, he just disappears. Because, well, if he's not thinking, then he can't exist, right? And you might be asking me, well, what about the horse? I was like, well, I have to apologize for getting Descartes before the horse. So I know it's a cheap joke, but this is the kind of jokes philosophers tell sometimes about their favorite philosophers. So anyway, Descartes is going to begin an entire methodology based on that cogito. And I'll see if I can't draw out some of the implications of that. Now, Descartes is also going to kind of have some other effects on the whole emergence of science that aren't quite so good. He totally abhorred the idea of a vacuum. That is like the atoms in the void of a vacuum and so forth. And so he did not believe that a vacuum could exist. And so this is going to be one of the things that will be held for quite some time by Cartesians, is that a vacuum cannot exist. And so that will be something going forward in the history of ideas that will be a kind of a flaw in his thinking. Now, Bacon sought a method of empirical induction, and Descartes sought a certainty of knowledge through reason. He was no humanist. He did not look back to the humanist. He too wants to start over with his cogito as the beginning of all knowledge. And so he doesn't look back to the Renaissance, and he doesn't agree with the Renaissance thinkers to hark back to the past himself. But he was certainly educated in their ways and knew what they had been doing. So the indubitability standard for certainty is going to emerge. Skepticism has to be vanquished, and it had ravished Europe for many, many years. And so there had been a 30 Years' War right around this time that Descartes is writing his discoursal method. The 30 Years' War was a long religious war that had deep, deep implications for Europe. Roughly the same number of people died in the 30-Year War on a percentage basis as died in World War II, in Germany at least. And so it was a very damaging war. And it was a religious war. And so it basically created a lot of skepticism about what the truth is. Then you had explicit efforts to reintroduce skepticism like that of Michel de Montaigne. And Montaigne also was Frenchman, and you can see a lot of Montaigne in Descartes' writings. For example, Montaigne sets out to describe in his essays not the world, but the way he saw the world. He would write only about himself. And in a way, Descartes, in his Discourse on Methods, says, look, I'm just telling you how I am going to proceed examining the world from now on. And hint, hint, if you want to follow me, that would be a good idea. But I'm just telling you the way I see things and the way I'm doing it. So there's a little bit of Montaigne there in Descartes. But what Descartes is going to try to do is to fight skepticism with skepticism, and he does that by finding the Cogito. You also had the Protestant Reformation that had created a lot of skepticism simply because it had totally upset and turned the world upside down religiously. Then you have Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo, who had introduced this new understanding of the cosmos, and it had deep implications for many things, not just theology. Also, on top of that, there were new discoveries coming in all the time around the world from geographical expansion. New cultures have been discovered, all kinds of strange, bizarre things like the Aztec civilizations that had giant pyramids just like the Egyptians and other things like that. All this is streaming in, and people are trying to put things together. And it had created a kind of a skeptical age, and Descartes wants to fight against that. So let's take a look at some of the main steps of Descartes' method in his attempt to avoid skepticism. Now, the first thing he says is that the only ideas that he is going to accept are going to be the ones that are clear and distinct to the mind, to his mind. In other words, he's not going to accept the truths of an authority. He's not going to start with biblical revelation. He's not going to start with Aristotelian authorities, scholastic authorities, church fathers, or anything like that. He's going to accept only ideas that are very clear and distinct to his mind. Now, that may not sound all that earth-shaking, but it was, because it is going to put the individual at the hub of knowing. All knowledge is going to be individualistically driven, and this is going to advance the whole idea of individualism as well. Okay? Next, every problem must be divided into as many smaller parts as possible. So, in other words, take any problem or any issue and break it down into as many possible parts as you can. Then, solve the smallest problems first, and then the next, and the next, and the next, until you solve the greatest question of all, the greatest issue at hand. Then subject the solution to general problem, or to the general problem, subject it to rigid verification, and make sure that you take very careful notations recording everything along the way. So, that's his basic methodology in which he's going to approach the world. You might be thinking, well, that's a very simple methodology. I'm only going to accept things that are very clear and distinct to my mind. I'm going to break things down into the smallest number of parts as I possibly can. I'm going to solve the small ones first, and then to the bigger ones, and then I'm going to subject all of this to verification, that is empirical verification, and also keep careful notes on everything. So it's a very simple methodology, but what it's going to do, it is going to create a big shift in the world of science. In other words, everything is going to be focused now on rational understanding of the world. And we're going to push aside whole libraries full of old books and old authorities. See, one of the problems that had emerged is this. People thought that, well, if somebody has believed something for 2,000 years, and this has been established for 2,000 years, you have to go with it. You have to believe it too. You can't push aside a system like the Ptolemaic system of the solar system. You can't push that aside. It's been believed for 2,000 years. Who are you to question that authority? And Descartes' like, well, we're going to completely change the whole methodology here. We're not going to accept anything on the basis of authority. We're only going to accept things that are clear and distinct to a rational mind. Okay, so the rational individual is going to become the center of knowing. Now, as a mathematician who invents analytic geometry, Descartes wants the kind of certainty that it could give him. Why can't we have certainty for everything like geometry, he asks. He sets out to found that new certainty. But math must be the basis of science and truth. Math must be the language of science. And so he gives science his analytical geometry as one of the tools, one of the mathematical tools for doing that. So not scripture, not the classics like the humanist thought, not Hermeticism, not magic, not the Kabbalah like Pico thought. None of these authorities are going to be able to speak into the questions of how to understand the world. We have to start over. The next thing we want to look at are some scientific developments that occur after Descartes. And we're going to look here at Newton's Principia Mathematica of 1687. Newton is going to be the father and the central figure of modern science. Now, so we've looked at all those astronomers, Kepler and Galileo, and then we have Descartes, who's also seeking a mathematical model for knowing. But it's going to be Newton who is going to be the great high priest of science in the 17th century. He is going to be the one who attains nearly epic proportions or epic status as the scientist. We will speak of classical physics, and speaking of classical physics, we're talking Newtonian physics. And his accomplishments are unparalleled in the history of ideas. He's second possibly only to Einstein in terms of his status as a scientist. So he remains the central figure in modern science. His Principia Mathematica of 1687 sharply focused the scientific movement into a brilliant ray of light, and it revealed the basic laws of physics with mathematical accuracy that we can still use today. If you're going to be sending a satellite out to Pluto to photograph Pluto and go out and beyond, you're going to be using Newtonian physics. You're going to be using the type of formulas, mathematical formulas that he discovered. And so you can see that many things in this world still build upon the Newtonian physics. Now, some of Newton's accomplishments, scientific accomplishments. Many of the problems that he inherited came from Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler. He corrected many of their serious errors. And foremost among these problems was the law of universal gravitation. He was going to be able to mathematically solve the problems of planetary motions and give us the laws of gravity with mathematical explanations so that we could calculate them. And so he was able to explain the tides. He was able to, and that was an important part. Tides moved according to the gravity of the moon, of course, and he had to explain that, and how to determine the density of the Earth and the density of other planets. He also invented the concept and mathematically explained something called centripetal force, which is essential for explaining the orbits, like the moon around the Earth, but also the Earth around the sun. And if that wasn't enough, he also invented something called calculus, a mathematical system still used today to model the dynamic changes in complex systems of movement. Now, Leibniz, a German philosopher, rationalist philosopher, will also invent calculus at the same time. And so there was a long-standing dispute between the two about who invented calculus first. It was an idea whose time had come because the problems that the world needed to solve needed calculus. And both of them came up with this idea, this new mathematical methodology. And so, but they're different, they're slightly different, and so we know that they were not really copying each other. Newton's achievements brought him acclaim in his own lifetime. He became the president of the Royal Society, which was at the center of scientific progress in England for benefiting society. In the 18th century, science will build upon Newtonian methods and will leap forward in chemistry, medicine, industry, and far more. Science will become a new worldview. Deism will arise to challenge theism. The idea of deism is that God is not involved in this world. He created it, but then gave it order, but left it. And so that is the deistic idea. Many people were trying to see this world as a giant mechanism that could be explained by the laws of physics and explained and described mathematically with Newtonian mathematics and physics. And therefore we didn't need God in the system to explain things. And so deism emerges as a possible solution to reconciling those together. And so that was very popular in the 18th century. Eventually a full-blown naturalism will emerge out of that. Now, Newton himself was not a deist or a naturalist. In fact, what Newton liked to do in his own spare time, when he had free time, was study the scriptures. He was far more interested in that. And he would study the Old Testament and try to solve some of the problems that were in the Old Testament. And so this was one of his favorite fields of study. But the mechanistic universe, the idea of a mechanistic universe, and that we too, as human beings, are machines in this mechanistic universe, is going to become a major new worldview with full-blown philosophical naturalism. The idea here is that the laws of science can discover and describe everything with enough observation and enough investigation. We will just not only understand everything, but we'll also be able to progress, and science will be our savior. Science will solve our problems. So now that we've looked at many of the elements of the scientific revolution, let's draw a few conclusions. This has been a very brief sketch on the rise of modern science, on modernity, and the epistemological shifts that are going on at this time. In the 17th century, our culture turned a corner and headed off in a new direction. And it's a new direction and a new path that we still mostly follow today. It was a quest to build knowledge anew on new foundations and not use any of the old rubble from old foundations of knowledge, especially Aristotelianism and scholasticism. This scientific age will give birth to the applied sciences, and these applied sciences will give us the Industrial Revolution and all kinds of technology that we enjoy today. And so this is a zeitgeist of progress that hovers over culture. But some of the implications are that we must ask about science, that there are questions that science cannot answer. Some areas people still question the authority of science in our values and morality, government, the proper way to organize human beings together for their maximal achievement, questions of justice. An ominous feeling looms that science gives us powers that we cannot properly use, especially after World War I and World War II, where science was used to create machines of mass destruction. And so in the wrong hands, scientific prowess has led to many catastrophic effects. And so while we want the benefits of science, we also fear that the amazing powers of science will fall into the wrong hands who might choose to do evil with it. And so in addition to a technology turned back on human progress, turned back upon us to destroy us, scientific progress in morality and values also leaves much to be desired. And so one of the key problems that we have to ask today is, how do we reconcile, or how do we balance scientific progress with moral progress and with progress in justice and other necessary parts of human justice?